Dear brothers and sisters, through the Spirit of St. Augustine, this is a homily for 17th Sunday in Ordinary Time, Year B. Little, enough, and much. That is the message we get from the liturgical readings of this 17th Sunday. Christ fed 5,000 people with 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish, meaning that it was little, but with Christ it was enough for the people and even much because they collected the remnants. What little do you have that Christ can multiply? However little it is, involve Christ and it will be enough and even much for others. Indeed, God takes care of our biological and spiritual needs. To begin with, the Gospel passage today can be understood in relation to what happens in the first reading. There, we find a man who offers 20 loaves of bread and some fresh grains to God through prophet Elisha. Given that it was a period of famine, Elisha tells him to use it to feed 100 people, of which he did, and some even remained. Here, we see the little loaves of bread, but with the involvement of God, it was enough for 100 people who were starving. From this story, we can learn 2 things. 1, the generosity of the man who brought 20 loaves of bread and some grains to offer to God. Do we offer to God the best first fruits like that man in the passage? 2, where God is involved, little becomes enough and even much. Do we involve God in our little things such as our objectives? Indeed, God here takes care of our biological and spiritual needs. In the Gospel passage today, we find a similar story concerning the feeding of 5,000 people with little loaves of bread and some fish. According to St. John, the bread section in this chapter 6 is an introduction to the discourse about the bread of life. Nevertheless, according to the Synoptics, Christ performed this miracle, the multiplication of bread, because he had compassion on the crowd, as we saw last Sunday. More importantly, according to this passage, there are 3 major situations that Christ comes in to offer the solution. First, the crowd follows Jesus to the other side of the sea because they were interested in signs or miracles. Here, Christ is their solution, even though he performed the multiplication of bread as a pointer to deeply understand and grasp the reality about the bread of life. Second, a large crowd of people and a little boy who had only 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. As far as feeding is concerned, it is really complicated to feed 5,000 people, but Christ comes in to offer the solution. First, he asks Philip, "Where can we buy some bread for these people to eat?" Philip's response is really shocking because he talks about how much one should have in order to buy some food. But in the real sense, the question was about where to buy and not how much money is needed. Christ turns to Andrew, who proposes that there is a little boy with some 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish, even though he doubts whether that will be enough for the crowd. Christ comes in to offer the solution by receiving the 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. He prayed and distributed the bread to the crowd. Although in the Synoptics, it is the disciples who distributed the bread and fish to the crowd. Lastly, inadequacy of human efforts. First and foremost, Christ turns to human efforts in search for the solution, as witnessed by the response given by Philip and Andrew. However, their responses were inadequate. In fact, it is clear that in such complicated situations, the only thing that the human person can do, as seen in this passage, is to make the crowd sit down and after eating, to collect the remnants into 12 baskets. Generally speaking, human efforts are limited or rather cannot do much. But when God is involved, the impossible becomes possible. On the other hand, the crowd expected much from Christ. That is, after having eaten, they wanted to make Jesus a king because he could provide them with biological needs. But that was not what the multiplication of bread was all about. In fact, it was to help them understand that Jesus is the bread of life that came down from heaven. To conclude, on this 17th Sunday in Ordinary Time Year B, we learn that God fed 5,100 people. He feeds billions of people even today. The generosity is important in our life as Christians, and sharing is caring. The little that one has can be multiplied by God to be enough and much. What do you have that you want Christ to multiply? It could be your dream. Involve Christ in it, and that little dream will be enough and much for you and for everybody. To the person whom sufficient is not enough, nothing is enough without Christ. Amen. Have a blessed Sunday.